Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Nicky Morgan, former Education Secretary in David Cameron's government and Culture Secretary for 6 months under Boris Johnson, first as an MP and then from the House of Lords as a Conservative peer. Labour's Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, an MP for 10 years and a Labour Party member since the age of 15, Bridget Phillipson. Joining us down the line from New York, world-renowned economist, professor, former chief economist of the World Bank and Nobel Prize winner, Joseph Stiglitz. And Longfield, the Children's Commissioner for England, with particular responsibility for vulnerable children and those who are looked after by the state or who are in care. And founder of OVO Energy, set up 11 years ago, and now the UK's second largest energy supplier. He also ran a Formula One racing team, Stephen Fitzpatrick. Good evening. Welcome to my guests here in the studio and to Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who joins us down the line from New York. Our live audience is with us again via video link this evening from Sedgefield, which of course is every bit as exciting as New York. Very good to have you with us. And for all of you watching at home, do join in the conversation. You know how to do it by now on social media, at BBC Question Time. It's good to have your company. Let's know what you think. Right, let's take our first question tonight, which is from Stephen Way.
Thank you, Fiona. Good evening, everyone. Why did Rishi Sunak wait so long to come up with today's new plan when so much of the UK has been struggling for weeks?
So why did you wait so long, Nicky?
Well, actually, what's happened is that this is the third time in a month that Rishi has responded to the developing situation. And that obviously comes on the back of over £200 billion of economic support that the Chancellor and the government have given to businesses, to those who are self-employed and to individuals in this completely unprecedented year.
But why has he waited till now, given the huge row there was over Greater Manchester just on Tuesday? This must have been in the pipeline. Why not announce it then?
Well, because I think, obviously, it takes time to work through the ramifications of the package, everything else. And don't forget, of course, the furlough scheme, originally set up in the spring, only expires at the end of this month. So actually, it's about looking at what is the situation, what is the support that's needed, and listening to what people are saying. And of course, Greater Manchester, as the other areas that have gone into Tier 3, have had that additional support as well, money that local authorities will be able to also hand out to businesses. I mean, I think this has been unprecedented, and just look at the impact on our public finances, the right thing to do, but at some point that bill is obviously going to have to be paid.
Bridget?
It is incredible that it's taken so long, and I just don't accept that things have changed so much that it's required that level of adjustment. I mean, he promised us a winter economy plan not very long ago at all. We're not even into the winter. The situation hasn't changed so much that he needs to revise that, and it just doesn't represent a long-term plan for how we get through this. We've seen lots of jobs lost while this inaction has been there. Businesses going bust, people losing their jobs. It's a matter of days until what we've got in place expires. And all of that worry and anxiety that is being caused, he's had to undo problems of his own making. And that's not good enough when, we're dealing with a situation, it is unprecedented, but people's livelihoods are on the line here. And, the health response and the economic response is going to have to be better joined together, because we're in this position where, the test, trace and isolate just isn't working as it should. The government has spent a considerable amount of money on it. But actually, the figures out today show that fewer contacts than ever are being tracked down. People are waiting too long to get test results back. Until the government gets a grip on the health crisis, the economy just won't recover.
Stephen, do you think Rishi Sunak has waited too long? And do you think what he's offering is enough?
So, I can remember, I set up OVO Energy in 2009, and I remember in the early days, I knew all my employees' names. I knew them personally. Moving quickly was really easy. We could make decisions, we could react to competitors, we could react to customers really quickly. And something I've learned over the last 10 years is the bigger the organisation you're running, the longer it takes to make change. And what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, we have seen a very dynamic landscape. The rate of infection has been unpredictable. It's been rising in many parts of the country. And I have a lot of sympathy for civil servants and politicians who are having to react in real time to this. And if you think about something as complicated as this employment scheme, and the furlough scheme and everything. I look at this and I say, I've been very impressed at how the machinery of government, I'm not just saying the government, but the machinery has been able to move so quickly. Because the thing that we really have to avoid is the kind of confusion that has come from badly executed communication or inconsistent policy execution. And I think if it takes a little bit longer, of course, everybody wants it done yesterday. But if it takes a little bit longer, then it takes a little bit longer. And the problems that we're going to face, they're going to last for years and years and years. And so it feels very urgent at the moment, but getting it right and making sure it's clearly communicated, I think, is going to be the most important thing in making it successful.
And Joseph Stiglitz, do you think the UK is getting it right when it comes to how the UK is handling the economy and supporting businesses?
Well, first let me say I think the delay in the UK has been unconscionable. The deficiencies in the program were known for a while. The course of the disease is not perfectly predictable, but it was very clear that it was not under control, so that there was very clear that there was a need for additional assistance. One doesn't get it perfect at any moment of time, so I agree with what's just been said. This is a complicated, but delay causes irreversible damage and enormous anxiety. Now, the one thing I can say about the UK is it's a model of good behavior compared to the United States. So,
in what way in particular?
If that's the basis of your comparison, you've done well.
And in what way in particular do you mean?
Well, the United States programs ended in June, July, and the Trump administration has been unable to even come up with an adequate program. The particular scheme that we had was not as well designed as your initial furlough scheme, which was not the optimal design. One of the reasons that unemployment in the United States has skyrocketed is that we had a deficient scheme in keeping workers affiliated with their firms. And our unemployment insurance scheme was incapable of responding to the millions of people joining the unemployment roll. And in the United States, it's even much more important than in the UK because most Americans depend on employers for their health insurance. And the last thing you want in the midst of a pandemic is to have no health insurance. So you should appreciate the National Health Service in that you, even if you lose your job, you still have health insurance. In the United States, these people losing their jobs, many of them don't have health insurance. So it was all the more imperative to keep workers linked with their firms, and we failed miserably. And I can go into all the reasons why it failed, but it was a badly designed program, badly administered. Having the banks administer a small business program, you knew predictable what they would do. They gave the money to those that were better connected, which was not the most vulnerable firms or the smallest firms, the most needy firms. They gave it to those who had better connections. So, as you look around the world, I guess I would say UK has not done as well as countries like New Zealand and many other countries. But on the other hand, you've done a lot better than the United States.
Anne?
Well, it does feel very kind of last minute. And I think, this evening there'll be people who will be much more confident about where they stand than yesterday. But that also means that there's people and families especially that have been through an awful lot over recent weeks, not knowing what will come. Everyone who's been on the furlough scheme has known it's come to an end at a certain point. And I think that has been a huge stress for people. And also, a lot of people have gone on to the universal credit already. We know 450,000 families have, and many also thought that's where they were ending up too. So I think, clearly there's been a lot happening at pace, but this is the long term. We need to start now seeing what recovery plan do we need to have in place? How can we support families to make the best decisions for themselves? And obviously, I would say as well, the growing number of kids that are being put into poverty, how do we get those out of poverty and make sure no more extra come in?
Well, quite a few hands have gone up as we've been talking. Sarah?
It really doesn't help with the sense of a north-south divide and real resentment, I think, in the north that this has just magically happened the week that London has gone into tier 2.
David Owens?
I can't be the only person that's sitting here wondering where on earth all this money has come from and how on earth it's going to be paid back.
Yes. Eileen?
Compared to Spain, friends of mine in Spain, and their business has just gone totally bust, a very lucrative business, they got 20%. So in comparison, we've done very well.
Martin?
Yeah, I just wonder if there's a sort of lack of insight of government into actually what's happening. So, for example, I'm a school teacher, and I'm obviously back at school working full time, which is where I want to be. But for example, the sort of exceptional funding cost for helping schools with COVID ended in July, and now we have nothing. We have no money to pay additional funds to pay for cleaning or PPE. Do government actually have an insight into what's actually happening at a sort of local level?
Alan?
I think to announce the change to the system 9 days before the furlough system ends has caused excess anxiety amongst everyone, really, because no one could plan anything. All money's greatly appreciated, don't get me wrong. It's just to actually announce it 9 days before the furlough system ends doesn't give people time to adjust to make changes to their own finances.
I mean, this is what you're hearing. I mean, Eileen makes the point that we're doing better than Spain, for example, and Joseph says that we're not as good as some countries, but considerably worse than others. But you've got Sarah talking about the north-south divide, Alan there talking about, very little time to prepare, which comes back to Stephen's question, could this not have been done sooner?
Well, I go back to the changes and schemes had been put in place. So there was obviously the announcements in September about the winter economy plan. There were announcements in July about support for jobs, encouraging obviously employers to keep employees on and getting an extra bonus in January if that's what they have done. But as I say, this is, I think as Stephen said, it's a fast-moving situation, and actually it only becomes, I think, clear, and even then it's not completely clear.
But what do you say to someone like Sarah who says she finds it interesting that it's happening just as London is about to go into, or London is now in tier 2, whereas in Sedgefield, for example, they've had restrictions since mid-September. And yet the Chancellor's only just spoken about it today.
Well, but there have been restrictions in Leicester and restrictions in other places as well. And I think I completely, look, I understand, of course I understand the frustrations. To answer the question of the gentleman who said, do ministers and government know? The answer is yes, because all ministers are also pretty much constituency MPs. And so they absolutely will be looking at their inboxes, looking at their social media feeds, going to constituencies, hearing what is happening in people's lives. But government, of course, has to have a balance between all the different elements of the responses and listening. And trying to get that balance right is obviously a huge task. And it continues to be so because the situation continues to develop all of the time. And we see, for example, which businesses obviously have to remain closed and which are able to open gradually. And there's even a distinction between hospitality, between which can open and which can't.
I mean, I just really think that the whole way this looks is one that, is last minute, and it makes people feel they're living in a pinball machine. 1 week it's this way, 1 way it's that. And I don't think it's deliberate at all. I just think it's that difference between the fast pace of change for actual people's lives at the moment and then the machinery of government and the way the speed it takes to, or lack of speed it takes to make decisions. I mean, I think really what people need here is mature, calm discussion, information, ability to be able to plan themselves, and also that feeling of trust. And what I'm hearing here actually is that whether it's a north-south divide or whether it's looking at reasons for, late announcements, there's a need to build that trust. And I think transparency is the way that is going to be achieved.
I'm going to move on to another question, but before I do, I just want to say that we are looking for people to join our virtual audience next week. We are going to be in Lincoln, and the week after that we'll be in Lewisham in South East London. So if you live there or around that area, do get in touch. Go to the Question Time website, and fill in the form there, and we will get in touch with you. We'd love to hear from you. The audience is what makes this programme, so do get in touch with us at the Question Time website. Let's take another question, talking of our audience, from Susan Lowe.
Hello. Andy Burnham's stand in Greater Manchester. Is this a masterclass in how public servants should exercise representative democracy?
And what do you think, Susan?
Well, I think he was clearly listening to his population in Greater Manchester, which I'm not sure is something that I feel the government is doing, because I, for one, write to my MP on a regular basis, and I'm constantly told various responses that the government is wanting to put forward. What I don't get is the human feeling of what that MP representing my constituency thinks. And when when I think that the government is using the whip all the time for votes in Parliament, it's not achieving what we should be achieving in representing people of this country.
Stephen, what did you make of Andy Burnham's stand in Greater Manchester? Standing up for his people, or as others have seen it, dividing the country?
So I think the situation in Manchester was again changing very quickly, and I think Andy Burnham was absolutely right to try to drive for the best deal possible for the people of Manchester and represent his local population. I think that we look at a country the size of the UK, it's made up of it's a very diverse nation, and I think there are lots of parts of our society that I feel that are not being represented and not being listened to. And when I think back to the discussion that we might have about the presidential debate in the US, and I think about when we look at politics in the US and look even in the UK and see the Brexit debate that we had and how absolutely tribal it became, it's really clear that we've fallen into a situation where we're simply not good at listening to people that we don't agree with and come from a different tribe. And as somebody who grew up in Northern Ireland in the 80s and 90s, I've seen what happens when this really deteriorates to the worst, brings out the worst in people. And I think whether it's a north-south divide or richer versus poorer, we have communities like the arts feel that are underrepresented, people working in hospitality underrepresented. And I look at where we've come from March, when I remember really feeling a strong sense of national unity and solidarity, and that we were all in it together. And I look at how far we've come from that in just 6 months. And I think it's really quite an important moment. And I think if we can't figure out a way to come together and be more united, then it makes me very nervous for the future of the country. Now, I think it's not impossible that we start to get some good news and people start to feel more connected. But I think more than anything, we need to see this in our political leadership. And when I think about the way in which politics has become so toxic, and only looking at yesterday's debate in the House of Parliament, I would say if we can't get some grown-up, collegiate partnership from our political leaders, it's no wonder that the country feel that it's being torn apart. And so I, for one, would love to see Boris Johnson, Andy Burnham, Nicola Sturgeon, all of them working together in our interests. And I'd say, coming from Northern Ireland, if Aon Paisley and Martin McGuinness can figure out a way to put their differences aside and work together, then surely our leaders today can.
And of course, that's what the Prime Minister calls on Keir Starmer to do repeatedly, is to work with him and work together.
Well, and throughout this, we've sought to be constructive, but of course we have to give voice when we've got real concerns around how the government are handling this. And I think Andy Burnham has done an amazing job in standing up for the people he represents. And the same is true for local government leaders right across our country. But I think that the disrespectful, contemptuous way that the government is treated, not just Greater Manchester, but large parts of the north of England, I find worrying and really serious. In the northeast, we've had additional restrictions now for well over a month. Even longer in other parts of the north.
But hang on, because Labour are calling for a national lockdown. So presumably you're not objecting to restrictions. I know you want more funding from those restrictions. I mean, just since we're talking about that, how long would you like a national lockdown to go on for?
So we supported the introduction of local restrictions, but what hasn't come alongside that is any consistency or clarity around the funding that goes with it. So we've had meetings with ministers, as have council leaders. We can't get any answers around what we can expect, or this formula they apparently use to determine the funding for each area.
But just to be clear, if you did get the funding required, how long do you think the lockdown should continue?
Well,
or how long do you think it should be? Because obviously it hasn't started yet.
So as we've set out, we think that there should be a circuit break to reset where we are. This is the right time to do this, going into half term, where children will, for 2 to 3 weeks. So the government have got a chance to sort out, test, trace and isolate. It just isn't working. I mean, we were promised a world-beating system and we've got a barely functional system. Until that gets sorted out, we're going to be in a situation where we will face rolling lockdowns in regions right across the country. And, you know, I know from many of the people I speak to in my constituency, workers and businesses alike, they just want to know that there will be an end in sight to all of this. They've made enormous sacrifices to get us to this point. But this sense of, I think there's a growing sense of anger and alarm about how the government is handling this. And can we ever get to the point where we start to emerge and come out the other side?
Louis, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. You talk about a 2 to 3 week circuit breaker. A circuit breaker is just fancy language for lockdown. We had a 3-week circuit breaker in March. We're now 7 or 8 months into it. So what on earth are we going to achieve in 2 to 3 weeks that we haven't achieved in 7 to 8 months? There's no guarantee that it would end in 2 to 3 weeks. We would be in exactly the same position, just at a later date. We aren't dealing with the problem. We're just pushing it further and further down the line, in my opinion.
Do you want to quickly respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, the government has lost control of the virus. We're not in a position...
No, but respond to Louis, never mind the government. What about Louis' point about your suggestion?
That's why we're calling for a national circuit breaker. Until we get into a position where the government's got control of the virus...
So he's asking what difference you think it would make?
It would allow the government, it would allow us to dampen down infection rates, which are rising right across the country, not just in areas that are subject to local restrictions. It would allow the government to get a grip on test, trace and isolate and
what,
get
in
that
2 to
system
3
sorted
weeks?
out.
Do you think they'd actually get that test, trace and isolate would be world-beating in 2 to 3 weeks?
I think there are immediate changes the government could make to get the system working better. So to give greater powers to local councils to run some of that system, who are much better connected to what's going on than this current kind of privatised model that we've got at the moment, that involves giving over large sums of money to private consultants at a point where actually we could do that much better if that would evolve to local communities.
Jack, you've had your hand up for a while. Let's hear from you.
I have, because my husband's volunteering on test and trace. And I would just like to point out that although I do feel that the government could build a better system to manage that, it won't mitigate for people not picking up the phone. And it won't mitigate against people who are unprepared to share details to help trace people.
Eileen, you had your hand up as well.
I think that the opposition are just basically going against the government all the time, regardless of what it is. It doesn't matter what it was, they'll always go the opposite. And they've never, ever come up with a solution, a viable solution to prove anything at all. So I just think that Boris has done marvellous myself. And my family have been totally...
You're cheering up Nicky enormously, Eileen.
Why are you cheering up?
Nicky's looking very jolly at that.
I love that. I love that enthusiasm.
Well, I do. I think he's done a marvellous job. Really do.
Joseph...
And I despair if Labour are in charge. Doomed for all of us, I think.
You've got your work cut out there, I think, Bridget, to persuade Eileen.
A key target voter for next time, I think.
Joseph, I mean, the question is about Andy Burnham's stand in Greater Manchester. I don't know how closely you've been following that over there in the States, but obviously it's also in part about local politicians taking a stand against the national government.
Well, I think there is a lot of truth in the circumstances in different locations are markedly different. But there is a need for national leadership. And it's clear that in the initial phases of COVID-19, in both the UK and the US, the national leadership wasn't doing what it should. The idea of herd immunity, which was pushed, was an absurd idea. The good thing is that you've done a lot better than the United States subsequently. Our national leadership still hasn't come to terms with the problem. But the notion that at the core of the problem is developing social solidarity. That was what was pointed out before. And when you have leadership that is not developing that kind of trust and social solidarity, you're going to have a much poorer response to the pandemic. And that's why countries where there's a lot of social solidarity, leadership that exhibits that social solidarity, countries like New Zealand and South Korea have done a lot better, both in terms of the pandemic and in terms of the economic response. So it seems to me that there is a big, as I look across the Atlantic, I see a big failure in the national leadership in the UK, and a better national leadership would try to enhance that solidarity and recognize that there is both a need for national leadership, but also for local and local and regional leadership.
Leslie.
Hello. I feel there's a real disconnect between national leadership and the local leadership. And when there's research coming out that says that children in large numbers in the northeast towns are living in poverty, so 33% in Sedgefield, 41% in Middlesbrough, for instance. You know, we need somebody at local level to take the issue to the leadership. And I think after yesterday's debate, I didn't see that leadership at a national level. Does that concern you, Nicky?
What, this issue of...
Well, when not seeing leadership at a national level, hearing what Joseph has had to say and others.
I don't agree with that. And of course, we've also heard, say, from Eileen about her enthusiasm for Boris's leadership. So I think... So I'm sitting on a House of Lords committee at the moment called Life Beyond COVID. And, you know, imagine there is such a thing and we're going to get there eventually. And we will get there. We absolutely will, because that is the history of pandemics through the years. But we obviously don't know how and when. And actually, people's experiences of this year are very much conditioned, or people's views are very much by their own experiences. And Steve was right to mention, people are now not divided about Brexit, they're divided about their view on lockdown. Some people feel very strongly that another national lockdown is the right thing to do. I totally disagree with that. And other people feel it has to be very much regional. And actually, the point that Leslie's just made, and I'm sure that Anne will have something to say about that, given her role, the great sadness is that we've spent 3 years arguing about Brexit, and then just at the time when actually the country was hopefully going to be able to move forward and tackle children's outcomes, social care, we are now obviously, all of us, having to deal with this virus. I think there is far more social solidarity than actually people realise. I obviously live in the Midlands, and communities are still very much helping each other out. There's a headline today in the Times saying that actually young people are taking the responsibility of social distancing seriously, and that is beginning to bring the numbers down. And that is what we are going to see, throughout this period, obviously, of the virus. And in terms of where we started on this question was about regional leadership. Look, for disclosure, I'm married to a local authority leader. I am watching him and his colleagues obviously debating with ministers and others about restrictions and what's going to happen and everything else. And I think actually what is right is that regional, local authority leaders and national leadership obviously have to work together. It's very difficult because national leadership will often be able to see things, the picture across the country, in a way that inevitably regional or local authority leaders can't and won't, and in a way they shouldn't, because they are there to stand up for a local area. But where we started with the question about Andy Burnham, my worry about the way that he has conducted things is that somehow to say that's right is to say that those people like Dan Jarvis and Joe Anderson and Steve Rotherham in Merseyside who have not behaved like that, have not done right by their communities, and I don't think that is right at all. I think everyone has to approach this differently, and it's quite right that we're going to see, I think we should see rolling regional lockdowns if that is what is needed, because it would not be right. The Prime Minister is absolutely right. We have to keep the economy moving as much as we can in certain areas of the country, whilst accepting that, sadly, until we are through this, the way we want to live our lives is going to be curtailed.
Anne, the question, was what Andy Burnham did this week a masterclass in local democracy?
So what I think is happening is that actually local and national leaders, and I'm a fan of the new mayors, are having to find out a new way to work together that actually can be constructive. It's new, people aren't used to it. And actually, it's working more or less. I think Andy was absolutely right to represent the real need of those people in Manchester and the like. But clearly, it fell into a place where actually all the airwaves were full of the unpleasant and seemingly unsympathetic way that the talks came to an end. Now, again, what I'd say about that is actually the more the airwaves are full with that, the less time there is to look at the real problems, which I'm hearing from the people asking the questions here, which is actually child poverty is rising, especially in the northeast, how actually families are going to find their way forward, what comes next, and how can people feel that level of trust in their leaders, both nationally and locally. I think, again, we need to have that real confidence in our leaders, be they nationally or locally, having that grown-up debate. And if it does fall into point scoring at all, really, and not saying anyone is at this point, then that is absolutely missing the point.
Matthew.
I honestly just wish that the North East had its own Annie Burnham, because we've been facing these similar tier 2 restrictions for so long now, and we've not really had anyone to step up to the plate and fight our corner for us. And we've watched many of our local businesses just go unheard, close shop, and the announcement today from the Chancellor has just come too late for our region, and it's really disappointing, to be honest.
Let's take another question from Sarah.
Is it now the case that Premiership footballers care more about children going hungry than most MPs?
So this is, of course, as a reference to Marcus Rashford and his campaign to get free school meals throughout the holidays, and Labour has supported the idea throughout the holidays until Easter. I mean, Anne, obviously I'm going to come to you first as Children's Commissioner for England.
Well, certainly Marcus Rashford, young guy, 22, really talented individual and footballer, has rocketed this issue centre stage. It's something that people have campaigned for a long time, but he brings that personal experience. And, you know, what he's able to do is say, look, for these kids, life is limited in every way. You know, I can't forget the first time I went into a secondary school and saw food banks and saw washing machines actually there to wash the kids' clothes. That's the reality for a growing number of children, and one which, you know, the accusation last night was that it was a sticking plaster. It may not be the full answer, but actually we need a long-term plan. Until we have it, the bottom line surely has to be that children get the help they need to not go hungry. And I remain absolutely astonished that we're still having this debate. It's 2020, you know, a wealthy country. It has the air of Dickensian about it. And I actually think that people do want to do the best for kids. And we've done that. Government's been bold and generous in providing free school meals over recent months. And to continue that while we're in the midst of the crisis and pandemic, to me, sounds basic.
So what do you make of comments, for example, from one Tory MP during the debate, where's a slick PR campaign encouraging absent parents to take some responsibility for their children? I don't believe in nationalising children.
Well, there's always a debate, you kind of have children, you should look after them, kind of a bit like pets. But again, I thought we'd kind of move beyond that. Of course, families want to look after their kids. Of course, they want to provide for them. But we know that reality is that kids often do not have food in the cupboards. I had a group of Newsround kids come to see me, really bright individuals, but they told me they would go home and not know what was in the cupboards. And for a lot of us, that's difficult to imagine what that means. But it takes away all your confidence, all your self-belief, and all your ability, actually, that the future is going to have any promise for you. So I think, you know, we are in the middle of the pandemic still. We are at crisis point. There's a growing number of children who are in poverty. That's not going away. It needs a serious plan. And I want government, and I would say this, whatever government was there, actually to see it as their mission that they reduce poverty and food poverty. It is something that governments can do. We've seen pensioner poverty reduced drastically over recent years. But really, the focus has to be, because if we're going to level up, and, you know, if anyone's going to, you know, in the Northeast, everyone wants the Northeast to succeed. But actually, people have to be able to know that they're going to be able to be financially viable to do that. And kids need to know that they're going to be able to succeed and thrive.
Martin. You're a teacher, of course. What's your perspective?
I am. So one of the basic rights of a child, according to the UN, is to the right to nutritious food. And I think the comments in Parliament, for example, it's really important to remember poverty is not a choice. It's not a lifestyle choice. And children have the right to nutritious food. And I think really the government needs to sort of understand that. And actually, if they can fund Eat Out to help out, then surely they can fund something that would prevent children from going hungry.
David Jasper.
Thanks, Fiona. I just find it hypocritical that they voted against extending the free school meals, and yet they voted themselves a £3,000 plus pay rise.
Well, they didn't vote it for themselves. I mean, it's an independent committee that, I've got that right, Nicky, haven't I?
That's right.
And Bridget, that does that. But I hear your point. Stephen, what did you make of the debate and Marcus Rashford's campaign?
I think, first of all, Marcus Rashford, what an inspiring young man. And I have to say, it is really impressive to see, and we were used to other kinds of headlines about footballers, but to see this young man be such a role model and really inspiring in his courage and bravery to stand up for something he really believes in. And I think the government...
Do you think the government was right to oppose the motion?
So we had a brief discussion, it came up in the previous question, it was about trust, and it was about the social cohesion and trust in the government, and we've seen countries around the world that have done well with coronavirus, the COVID-19 response, that have both trusted in the people and have the trust of the people. And if you look at Jacinda Ardern's election win in New Zealand, it's been described as an example of compassionate competence. This is a different kind of democratic government.
I still don't know whether you think the government should have backed it or not.
No, I think it's an absolute own goal. I think
so they should have.
I don't understand how it is that even if they don't believe with the detail of this, they could at this time vote against money for children. And I think one of the things we're seeing with COVID-19 is it is exacerbating and making worse social divides that we already have in this country. We have a huge problem with inequality. OVO Energy as a foundation, one of our investment themes is early years education. And there is such a dramatic problem with the fact that in the 21st century, children that grow up in Britain, their economic success in life is already mostly predictable at the age of 5. And we just need dramatically more investment in children, in education, and free school meals for children on school holidays is just so obviously an opportunity for the government to show some compassion.
Bridget.
I mean, it's just inexplicable that in the middle of this terrible pandemic, as we come into a really difficult winter for lots of families, that the government won't support this. I think Marcus Rashford has done an incredible job as someone who was himself once poor and hungry, speaking up for vulnerable children who don't have a voice and to make sure that no child goes hungry this Christmas. I mean, we are such a wealthy country with great opportunity, and it is a scar on our country that so many children grow up in poverty, avoidable poverty. The government could step in, not just in this area, but I think, you know, as Anne was just saying that, you know, this is one aspect of what we've seen as a growing trend in recent years, where more and more children, including those in families where there is work, are finding that money just isn't there and it doesn't stretch. And that's putting families in an impossible position. Now, you know, when I grew up, as someone who spent part of my childhood on free school meals in a single parent family, I was lucky. Lots of the other kids I grew up with weren't so lucky and they weren't so fortunate. I thought we as a country, we could put those days behind us. We're going backwards. And it breaks my heart to see kids in my community just going hungry in the midst of this terrible, terrible crisis.
Joseph.
Well, I find this debate actually amazing. I do find what the government did unconscionable. You know, in New York City, when we closed the schools in the lockdown, one thing we kept was the school lunch programs. People could go to the schools and get the lunches that they would have otherwise gotten. You know, a lot of careful social distancing and all that. But the fact that a child who doesn't get food can be scarred for life and obviously can't learn in the way that they should. So as everybody's been saying, it's a basic human right. The unit is the child. Your child is a person. You're talking about the future of the UK. And the fact that you're not in the Dickinsonian era, you're in the 21st century, that you would be having this debate about whether children should have adequate nutrition, I find quite unbelievable.
I mean, Nicky, you supported legislation that would give the poorest children free school meals over the holidays back in 2017. Is this a good look for the government?
Well, I think the Labour Party might have found they got more supporters yesterday if the Deputy Labour leader hadn't called one of the Conservative MPs scum in the course of the debate. I mean, I have to say, yesterday's debate...
I'm not sure that anyone's defending that, but that's not exactly the point, is it?
The point is, if you want to build a coalition, we've heard comments saying it's unconscionable that the government didn't support this. Well, if the Labour Party had really wanted, and I think that Marcus Rashford, unfortunately, he complained about it becoming politicised, if the Labour Party really wanted support, they wouldn't have made it what's called an opposition day debate. There will be other ways to build a coalition in Parliament. And I should just challenge the fact that obviously as Education Secretary...
So was it a political reason then that the government didn't support it, or did the government not support it because it doesn't believe in it?
The government has put in money dramatically to expand free school meals anyway.
No, I get that. I'm just trying to understand why the government didn't support it. Yes, is it because they didn't like the way Labour put the motion, or because the government doesn't believe in it on principle?
The government has spent over £300 million this year in making sure that school meal vouchers can be redeemed. And actually, to answer Joseph's point, that obviously when schools were not open in the spring and summer of this year, that is exactly when the government did put those hundreds of millions of pounds in to make sure that meals were available to those children who would otherwise be on free school meals. I personally think there are other ways. Anne's made a good point about needing an overall strategy, quite right. We can't do that in the middle of a pandemic, but actually making sure we work with local authorities, for example, who are, the clues, free school meals. So we give support to children at school and pre-breakfast clubs and after-school clubs and everything else. But at other times, when the schools have been open, there are other ways in which to get money, and the government is putting money into local authorities. But I'm sure we could do more to put money via local authorities to support families in need. But yesterday's handling of the debate, I say, watching that toxic debate in Parliament, watching the way that it was handled, Bridget knows if you want an issue really tackled, don't put it down as an opposition day motion if you want to build a coalition in Parliament.
So kids go hungry this Christmas because you don't like the parliamentary process?
If you really, the Labour Party, want to achieve, if you really want to get people supporting this debate, then as I say, labelling Conservative MPs unconscionable, unparliamentary words, and then the way that it was dealt, absolutely not. The government is putting that money in. The better thing would be to work together to make sure that actually local authorities and schools are able to get that money and help to support those children who are obviously otherwise not getting support at home.
I need to get some more in, but very briefly, what do you make of that?
So I think the whole issue of feeding children, which is absolutely fundamental, has got caught up in the political headlight here. And it's something which failed yesterday, I think, because it ended up as a secondary issue here. It is too important for that, and I do think people have to work together to put this aside. There has been a lot put in over recent months, which means it's even stranger to not put that extra 40 million in over the next few weeks. That's what Wales is doing, that's what Scotland's doing. And at the end of the day, yes, of course, all those long-term plans need to be there, all of the different ways of supporting children, really important. But free school meals, be they in school or not, it does what it says on the tin. It gets straight to kids. Okay. You know they've got a meal. And actually, that's what gives kids and parents confidence too.
I just want to take a quick question from David Owens now. David.
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Given how long this has been going on, and there is no clear way out, are we all going to follow the rules?
Are you?
Well, bearing in mind that certain police officers, Owen Weatherall and Andy Rhodes, don't seem to know the rules, it's very difficult because they seem to change every couple of minutes. You can go in a pub for a meal, but you can't go in just for a beer. We need to see the science. We need to see the evidence on all these rules.
Rita, I spoke to you earlier on before you came on the programme, and you had something rather interesting to say about following the rules.
Yeah, Fiona, I was just saying that, people need people. And my friend went through terrible experience last year that nobody should ever have to go through, no parent. And she lives alone. And although I'm not in her bubble, I would not hesitate if she needed me ever, or, you know, to go and see her and be with her, because people need people. And lots of people are not going to stick to the rules, and not just because of people, you know, there's so many people in this position.
Leslie, I see you nodding away there. Actually, quite a few of you nodding. Leslie, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I agree. It's very situational. I mean, I'm in lockdown at the moment. I've got 5 days to go before I come out of isolation. I've got family in Scotland under one set of rules, family in West Yorkshire. It's Sedgefield and Durham, we're in a different rule, and I've got a daughter in Wales, and we're all living in different variations and going into different types of lockdown. And it's hard to keep to the rules. So personally, I do keep to the rules because of my background working in the NHS and my feelings of social responsibility, but I can also self-isolate. I'm in that lucky position that I can do that.
So I'm just interested, given that we were in the national lockdown, it eased off over the summer, we're now heading back into who knows how long of restrictions here, whether attitudes have changed. Eileen, you've got your hand up.
Yes, hi. I'm 74 and I live alone and I need family, I need people just for mental health reasons, really. So I don't think I'll be totally sticking to it, whereas I am very careful and they're very careful with me. But what choices do I have, really?
And did you, just out of interest, did you stick to it sort of religiously the first time round, back in March?
Sorry?
Did you stick to it sort of
closely?
I did. You did. So your attitudes changed.
The
Louis.
first time round, but it was very, very difficult, very difficult. Now my grandson comes, does the garden. I have a great big garden and he comes and does it for me. And I have friends a couple of friends who come round, and obviously my daughters and sons. I don't have any choices. I couldn't live here on my own and I need help. It's a big house, I need help.
Louis.
Can't do it.
I think we've seen a couple of examples over the last few weeks throughout the country. We had an example at a funeral where a son was prevented from comforting his grieving mother because it went against the rules. We saw an interview on the BBC yesterday where an 83-year-old said that she didn't have many years left and she wasn't going to spend them confined in a house. I have an 83-year-old grandmother who lives alone. She's a widow. If I didn't go and see her, I think the threat to her mental health would probably equal the threat that COVID would eventually equate to. So at what point do the restrictions just get in the way of being a basic and decent human being?
Stephen?
Hi, Fiona. I'm a teacher at Sedgefield Community College, and over the past couple of weeks, we've been told we need to reduce our social contact. But I feel as a teacher and also other jobs as well, it is very, very difficult to reduce our social contact when we come into contact with hundreds of students every single day.
And Sarah, let me just hear one point from you.
My son is one of his students and he's currently isolating at home. Now, I'm a real stickler for the rules. Now, I totally understand the compassionate need to see people. I totally support that. But it's incredibly hard as a parent to be encouraging your children to follow the rules when they see people breaking the rules left, right and centre. I
mean, I don't want to spend too long on this because there's one more question I want to get in, but I'm just, Bridget or Nicky, just very briefly, if you would, how much of a concern is this? Because I suspect our audience here from Sedgefield aren't alone. They aren't naturally rule breakers, you know, making an assumption about the ones we've heard from. But they are acting differently this time round. And you know, especially with Labour, who wants a national lockdown. If people aren't going to obey the rules, what's the point?
We're not arguing for a national lockdown, but you know, in large parts of the north east.
You're calling it a circuit breaker. I'm not sure what the difference is. Let's not get into that now.
It's shutting down. Not an ongoing. No, we're not calling for an ongoing national lockdown. I mean,
well, okay, 2 to 3 weeks of a lockdown, however you want to define it. That's what it is. How concerned are you that people may not obey the rules anyway, out of sheer fatigue?
You know, it's clearly really tough, and I absolutely hear that. And in large parts of the north east, we've had additional restrictions in place for some time, and I know that people are fatigued by it, and they want to see a way through that.
And
but
Nicky,
of course we have to follow the rules.
Does this bother you?
Yes, and what it tells me is that actually what we are embarking on or engaged in is something as much as psychological as much as it is anything else. And that means that actually rules have to be designed, understanding how tough they are going to be for people and understanding what we are asking of them. I mean, obviously, I would encourage people to stick to the rules, but people have talked about the mental health burden, and that is obviously massive. But I think in the grand scheme of things, there will be a way out. We will get through. That is what history tells us. But unfortunately, it's going to be, obviously, a very difficult few months.
I'm going to take a final question, which, when I started on Question Time, dominated absolutely everything for months on end. I thought we were never going to talk about anything else. But let's bring it back. So, Carol, let's hear from you.
Hello. So, with global economies being affected with the COVID-19 pandemic, is now really the best time to be walking into a no-deal situation with the EU?
No deal, or Australia deal, as the government likes to call it these days. Joseph, let's hear your perspective as a Nobel Prize winning economist. What do you think?
Well, I think it was a bad thing to walk into a no-deal Brexit anytime, but this is an especially bad time. The global economy is going to be weak. There's a slowdown in everywhere, but in Europe, and that will on itself impose constraints on trade. And then there's a slowdown in the UK. And on top of all that, to put new trade barriers seems particularly foolish. And on top of that, to do it in a context where there's no deal, where there's uncertainty about the political, how was the Ireland issues going to be dealt with? Where are the boundaries? What will be the consequences? Enormous amounts of uncertainty. And what we've heard in the discussion in the last hour is how the pandemic has brought uncertainty, how the government's failure to give the kinds of assistance in the right time, in a timely way, has enhanced the uncertainty that individuals face. So we have the pandemic, we have the inadequate economic response to the pandemic, and now we have the uncertainty of a no-deal Brexit. It seems to me if you were going to maximize uncertainty, you couldn't have done a better job.
Stephen?
So I run a business now with about 7,500, 8,000 employees in the UK. We also operate in France and Spain. I run an aircraft business building electric flying taxis, as we discussed earlier, with a big European supply chain. And Brexit is not in the top 10 list of things that I spend my time thinking about or worrying about.
Is that because you wouldn't be affected particularly?
No,
if
we have
no
simply
deal?
that there are much bigger issues at stake right now. And I have to say, I think if you look at where we are right now in a negotiation, we've got a couple of months left to go. I think it's absolutely right that the government is saying we need to have a strong fallback position. As somebody who's been through a lot of negotiation, you have to be able to, in a negotiation, be able to say we're going to shake hands and walk away if we don't find an agreement. And you have to be in a position where people are ready for that. And I am optimistic, and I hope that we will find the right agreement. But if you look at the history of EU trade negotiations, it's very difficult. Canada negotiated for 7 years to get their free trade agreement, and it was held up by one state in Belgium for a year. And so this is, we're one state.
So what, God help us,
we're
is that
one
what you're
country
saying?
against 27. We have to have a robust negotiating position. But I think the other thing we need to think about is what kind of economy we're going to build. What does independence from the EU give us freedom to do? A more equal society, more investments in high-tech businesses, more renewable energy, carbon pricing and taxation. We're going to have COP26 in the UK next year, and we have an opportunity to lead the world in the net zero transition. And I think that's some of the opportunity we should be talking about and how we're going to rebuild our economy.
Anne?
Well, I think it's hard to believe, actually, this is almost a PS question, whereas at one point it dominated completely. And actually to
Tell me about it.
I know, I'm sorry. But to actually be able to, what it did do was it drove out any discussion about domestic issues for that time. So that was my real worry. It just absolutely wipe that off the agenda. Clearly, it adds to uncertainty. It wouldn't be ideal, but, you know, like it or not, it is going to happen. And what I think now people need to see is, what does this mean for the future? What does it mean in terms of jobs? What does it mean in terms of progress? And how will this help our area actually not only get back on their feet, but get ahead? There's a lot, obviously, at stake. And if this is coming as an uncertainty, it absolutely has to work for the kind of questions we've seen this evening.
Bridget?
I sincerely hope that we get a deal. You know, businesses in the North East are facing a tough enough time without this added uncertainty. You know, great manufacturing export businesses that depend on that trade. So I sincerely hope that the government do absolutely everything to get that deal and just, you know, drop the posturing, stop messing about, just get it done.
Drop the posturing, Nicky.
Well, I think the news today is the fact that discussions are continuing, and I think they will. I'm very hopeful that there will be a deal, so I don't think we're headed to the situation outlined by our questioner. But what we can't do is carry on extending the transition period, you know, getting businesses to prepare and then not prepare everything else. Fascinating to hear from Stephen about the fact that actually on his top 10 list of things to worry about as a business person, this is not on it. I don't know if it was, but it's not now.
But so, if I mean, hindsight is a marvellous thing, obviously, but if you had been able to look into a crystal ball and know that we were going to be leaving the EU in the middle of a pandemic with a recession forecast, the likes of which we have never seen or not seen for hundreds of years, would you really want to be doing it now?
Well, as you say, who knows? We never know what's going to happen. Probably what you would try to have done would be to have left completely by the 31st of January of this year, so that actually we were clear by the time the government had to obviously be dealing with the viral pandemic. And of course, the lesson we learned from the 3 years before that is if you keep kicking the can down the road, it doesn't get any easier. People voted the way they did in 2016, including many people in the parts of the country where we have guests on, audience on from tonight. They've waited a long time in order for this to happen. And I think it's right that we do get on with it. It is possible. We have ministers obviously engaged in that, civil servants engaged in that, and other parts of government obviously focused on the virus. It is possible to do both at the same time.
And how confident are you we'll get a deal?
I think both sides want a deal, and actually, fun enough, I think because of the need for national leaders to focus on the virus, actually I think they also, right the way across Europe, realise that actually having a deal would obviously make everybody's life much easier. I guess you can never say, because the other thing I learned about Boris Johnson is he's absolutely prepared to walk away in a way that our previous Prime Minister was not, but I think that we all know that, of course, life would be easier on the 1st January if we have that deal in place.
Well, we shall see. As you say, the discussions have started again today, and we'll see where they end up. Our time is up. Our hour is up. Tonight, our questioners came from Sedgefield. Thank you so much for joining us. You were absolutely tremendous. And next week, we'll be joined by an audience in Lincoln and by Rupert Soames, who is the boss of Serco, which, of course, is one of the companies involved in Test and Trace. And we'll also be joined by the former, however briefly, Director of Communications for Donald Trump, Anthony Scaramucci, also known as the Mooch. So why would you want to miss that? And the week after that, our audience comes from Lewisham in South East London. So do get in touch and take the opportunity to put your questions, get involved in the debate. We'd love to hear from you. Question time is what it is because of the audience. So let's hear what you've got to say. You can apply, as I said earlier in the programme, by going to the Question Time website. You can fill in the form there. We'll hear what you've got to say, and hopefully we will be part of our virtual audience for next week. For now, Adrian Charles and guests are on Question Time Extra Time. That's your chance to put your points to that on 5 Live. That's starting now, and you can see on the screen how to get in touch by phone or by tweet or by text. But for now, thank you very much to my panel for coming here this evening, socially distanced, as we always are now. To our audience in Sedgefield, thank you to you, and of course to Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who's joining us from New York. Thank you so much for your time this evening. And of course, thank you to you at home for watching from Question Time. Bye-bye.